Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to today's Tropical Weather Outlook for Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026. And today's topic of discussion will be on the Pacific mainly. We have an Invest 90E, which is pretty much on the verge of developing into a tropical storm. And yes, a tropical storm. And likely our first named storm of the season, Amanda. But we also have other things to watch in the Pacific as well, including development closer to Mexico, which I'm watching too, and how that might actually affect the Atlantic, which we'll go over later on in the video. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned for that. But let's start off, as we typically do, by taking a look at the National Hurricane Center Bulletin for what is happening right now. And really quickly, before we get to the Pacific, obviously nothing is expected in the Atlantic just yet over the next week or so. Although I will talk about how, once again, beyond the week time frame, I think especially the Gulf should keep an eye out on the tropics, as we might get moisture that'll stream into the Pacific, and it might make things interesting, to say the least, for the Gulf sometime next week. But we'll get to that later on. First off, in the Eastern Pacific, though, we have multiple areas of development right now. First off, here in the Eastern Pacific, with Invest 90E, and let's actually really quickly see if the tropical weather bulletin for the Eastern Pacific has been updated yet. Looks like for the Atlantic it has, but not yet for the Eastern Pacific. But I'm pretty sure not really much has changed since then. A high chance of development for Invest 90E right now, 48 hours at 80%, 7 days at 90%. Probably with the 2 p.m. Eastern Time tropical bulletin, we're probably going to get the 48-hour chances to go up to 90 or maybe even 100% here. So, only a slight change, but either way, a high chance of development with Invest 90E, and I think that's what the biggest takeaway from this will be. And very likely, we are going to have our first named storm of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season by the end of the day. But closer to Mexico, another area of interest, and I've been talking about this one especially closely because it looks like it'll be pretty interesting for Mexico, because whatever does develop will be closer to the Mexican coastline. So you won't have to worry about this area here, but something developing much closer to Mexico here. And once again, it's going to be a result of that Central American gyre, which I've been talking about a lot for the last week. And it's going to produce something more than likely here within the next week in the far eastern portions of the Eastern Pacific Basin. And once again, depending on how things shape up, it might have implications on the Atlantic side of things as well. But again, we'll talk about more on that in just a moment. Here's a satellite shot, though, of the Atlantic and the Pacific right now. In the Atlantic, there's nothing much to write home about just yet. Things are mostly dry throughout the deep tropics and the Caribbean. The Gulf, though, seeing quite a bit of moisture right now with showers and thunderstorm activity, once again, from moisture streaming northward into the Gulf from Central America, as I said would happen. And, this is going to result in pretty rainy conditions here along the Gulf Coast and for Florida as well over the next week to 2 weeks. I'll show you the models for the projected precipitation totals here, and I'll also show you the Weather Prediction Center forecast in a little bit. But lots of rain coming for you guys along the Gulf Coast, and I'm pretty sure you guys definitely need it, especially those across the southeast. And I know northern Florida has been dealing with a lot of drought conditions lately, so definitely this rain and this moisture in general will be much needed. And it's already panning out, and we've been talking about the fact that late May and early June we would see a lot of moisture in the Gulf, and we're already seeing it pan out right now. And obviously, this is going to be a separate topic of discussion that we'll go over later on. But in the Eastern Pacific, on the other hand, things are looking pretty interesting right now. Definitely some decent convective activity spread out throughout the basin, but what is especially interesting is Invest 90E here, which is in the western part of the Eastern Pacific, pretty far west for this time of year, especially if you saw my tweet on Twitter yesterday. Invest 90E is well west of climatologically where we typically see development in the Eastern Pacific this time of year. And to show you a close-up of it, Yes, we are talking about development. In fact, the latest satellite shots here of Invest 90E, you can pretty much already see a low-level center present on satellite. So definitely an indication to me that this is either already a tropical depression or storm, or very, very close to becoming one. In fact, I would not be surprised if in about a few hours here, the National Hurricane Center pulls the trigger and we see the first advisory on our first tropical system of the year in the Pacific. Taking a look at the vorticity signature, and it has a very decent vorticity signature, definitely a very solid low-level center here. Still a little bit elongated right now, although this map is probably about 2 or 3 hours old because this map updates every 3 hours, and the timestamp here is 15Z, so this is roughly 11 a.m. Eastern time. So again, about 2.5 hours old, but still a pretty decent vorticity signature, and I'd imagine in the last 2.5 hours since this map was updated, it's only gotten better and more defined. Luckily, though, 90E is going to go out to sea. I mean, there's really not much else to say with this other than this is going to be our first storm of the Pacific here, more than likely. But again, more than likely an out to sea track. It's going to move on off to the west-northwest here, and then, I guess maybe also northwest direction. And then probably as we get towards around 5 days out or so, it'll begin to slow down as it gets further northward. But it will probably fizzle out pretty quickly too. But in the meanwhile, this might actually become a pretty decent system, if I'll be honest with you. The model intensity guidance mostly indicating that this will be a tropical storm. In fact, as again I mentioned, there is a very high likelihood that this might already be a tropical storm. From what I've seen, there's ASCAT data that indicates that we might already have some gale force winds in this area here associated with 90E. So maybe right off the gate in about a few hours here, the National Hurricane Center will already give Invest 90E the name Amanda. But either way, it's definitely going to happen here in the next few days. Invest 90E is going to develop, become a named storm. A few models, though, not sure exactly which ones they are. Actually, I think the ship's model might be one of these ensemble members here, indicate that we might actually get a minimal hurricane out of this. Not exactly sure if that is what is going to happen, but honestly, it would be interesting if that were to be the case. But a lot of them still agreeing on the general idea of a tropical storm, maybe even a moderate to high-end tropical storm if we don't end up getting a hurricane, which would still be decent for the first storm, especially for the Eastern Pacific. But it's a named storm regardless, and first named storm of the season. But again, taking a look at the GFS here over the next several days, it's going to move out to sea, away from land, not going to be a concern to any one of us, and it'll probably kind of move on off to the northwest here, and then by the time we get to the end of the week this week, it'll definitely start to fizzle out as it runs into unfavorable conditions, and then it'll probably be of absolutely no concern and no thought at all whatsoever. But as you look closer here, as we get towards around 7 days out, you could start to see closer to Central America here, the beginnings of another system developing, and you could start to see it build, first of all, over Central America, and that's probably going to happen throughout the course of this week. We have vorticity that'll be developing over here, a broad low, and then it takes a few days. These Central American gyres are very broad, and it takes a few days for the energy to truly concentrate, but it looks like that's going to start happening around 5 or 6 days from now, and then beyond that, we get something here that tries to take off and head towards Central America, and obviously whatever develops here will be much closer to land, so we're going to have to keep an eye out on it, and certainly will mark the start of what will probably be a very busy Pacific hurricane season, as well as what is about to develop here with 90E in the Pacific. And again, we'll be monitoring this very closely here over the next week And there's still a lot of uncertainty because, most of the development happens around 6 to 7 days out. So a lot can change. And especially with these Central American gyre patterns, the models really change from run to run. They tend to be very, very messy. But the signal is certainly there on the GFS. And let's take a look at the euro as well. Let me bring it to the 0 euro because that goes out further. And yeah, we also see the signal here developing on the euro as well. In fact, interestingly enough, it almost looks like two storms try to develop here from whatever Central American gyre slash monsoon energy that gets going here in the Pacific. Either way, something is definitely going to develop closer to Mexico and closer to Central America here in the next week, and we are definitely going to have another named storm to track not long after whatever develops here with Invest 90E. But let's move on to the Atlantic for a moment and, put a pin on whatever is going to happen near Central America here in the Eastern Pacific over the next week, because we're actually going to get back to that in a minute. But first, let's see what's happening conditions-wise across the Atlantic right now. And once again, nothing much happening to note. Mostly dry throughout the deep tropics, lots of dry air, lots of wind shear as well, and also probably quite a bit of Saharan air moving off the continent of Africa right now. And these things are all very common in the early season in the Atlantic, but obviously, given that we're going to have a El Nino this year, lots of those things are probably going to be amplified, and we probably will see quite often periods throughout the hurricane season where this exact shot is pretty much going to be on repeat, if that makes sense. Looks like we have a wave that's moving off the coast of Africa here, and then we probably have a few other waves in general scattered throughout the tropical Atlantic right now, but obviously none of them are of note, and none of them are particularly strong. And then, of course, we have all of this mess of energy here associated with a front that is moving across the southwestern Atlantic, and obviously we also have moisture streaming northward into the Gulf right now, none of which, though, is really of interest in terms of development. And you can see that on the vorticity map here. Quite a bit of the vorticity, especially here along this front that seems to be moving off the east coast here. And again, I mentioned that these fronts sometimes tend to be interesting, especially early on in the season. And I guess this is somewhat of a representation as to why. Definitely lots of vorticity associated with this front here. Obviously, though, conditions are not really favorable for any of these low pressures or whatever vortices that we might have along this front to break off and potentially try to develop into anything meaningful, at least tracking-wise for the tropics. But it is still interesting nonetheless that you can kind of see that here already. Also, some energy here in the Gulf, though, that's not going to develop. And then we have energy kind of scattered throughout the deep tropics here, associated with whatever waves might be out there. But of course, none of that is really going to develop right now. Here's a look at the GFS, though, over the next week. And as you can see, something interesting does actually looks like it tries to happen here in the Atlantic. Although it, again, kind of stays elongated, and then definitely whatever does happen here gets booted off to the northeast. It's probably, once again, kind of strung out along whatever front that is in the southwestern Atlantic right now. But then beyond that, nothing else really interesting happens here for the next week. But then, once again, let's watch here closer to Central America, because I want to show you what happens really quickly. First off, in the East Pacific, obviously we have the Central American gyre, which will probably fuel some sort of tropical development here closer to Mexico and in the far eastern portions of the Pacific here. And then, at least on the 12Z GFS, a lot of that energy, because of the general steering pattern of the Central American gyre, a lot of that energy gets steered back into Central America and into Mexico. And then beyond 7 to 10 days, interestingly enough, the GFS brings that energy northward, and definitely by the vorticity signature here, that looks like a tropical system that tries to spin up in the Gulf from whatever remnant that we have of energy that lifts northward into the Caribbean. and develops in the Gulf. And obviously this happens beyond, not just beyond 7 days out, but honestly it starts getting beyond 10 days out. But this is part of a general overall pattern that I really think we should be watching as we head into the middle portions of this month. And I'm not saying that to kind of hype things up, that there will be something that'll happen in the tropics, but it is my genuine opinion. And if you've been following me for the last several weeks, you know I've been saying that mid-June, I really do think we will need to watch the Gulf for something to potentially develop. And I think this will probably be one of the avenues in which we get development that happens here in the Gulf. Whatever happens in the Eastern Pacific associated with the Central American gyre, we're going to have to watch and see whether or not it's able to lift northward, and we'll have enough moisture that makes it northward into the Gulf. And obviously from there we'll have to see if conditions are favorable. But one of the first indicators, in my opinion, we'll see is whether or not we're able to get enough moisture into the Gulf and decently northward enough and over water enough that something does develop. And then obviously here on the GFS, at least as of the latest run of the GFS, that does happen, and clearly the GFS shows tropical development here in the Gulf. Very far out, but it is a general pattern that I think we should be monitoring here over the next several weeks. And it's going to happen already right now with a lot of moisture in the Gulf, although really for a huge chunk of the next week or so, probably a lot of that moisture will be coming directly from Mexico, as you kind of see here. But in general, across the Gulf, across Florida, and across portions of the South, especially Texas here in the next week, lots of heavy rainfall expected. And probably beyond the next week here, let me really quickly show you how things pan out on the GFS here. We have a lot of moisture again already in place over the Gulf and across the Southeast. A lot of it streaming northward from Central America. And then, especially as we get into the 2-week time frame and we get beyond the next week, even more moisture streams northward from the East Pac and from the Caribbean northward into the Gulf. And we will have to see whether or not this moisture is able to manifest into something more than just a lot of rain. But even then, even if we do get just rain, that'll still be impactful in and of itself, because at the end of the day, the number one impact that especially a lot of these early season tropical cyclones bring in the Atlantic is rain. So, don't want to discount that as well. Rain is still an impact in and of itself. It could cause flooding, and really something that has kind of proven itself time and time again over the last several years is just how much people underestimate flooding as a major impact. So I definitely don't want to diminish it, but in terms of tropical activity, I think we'll definitely have to watch and see how much moisture is able to make it northward from the Gulf, especially if we're able to get remnant moisture from whatever system happens here in the Eastern Pacific over the next week to 2 weeks. So a lot of things interesting to watch in the tropics right now. It is hurricane season after all. It is day 2. So, obviously we're going to be keeping a close eye on signals in the tropics, but obviously for now, watching the Pacific closely. And whatever happens here, it's definitely all going to start in the Pacific. So I think we'll be watching the Pacific closely here over the next several weeks, and then eventually we'll probably transition to watching the Atlantic too. But with that being said, I'm going to end it off for today's discussion. Not much else to go over beyond that. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. If you like what you saw today, as I always do, I encourage you to like this video, comment your thoughts or any questions you have below, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you can get any video or any live stream or anything that I do the moment I upload it. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll talk to you guys again tomorrow.